throughout my life is I really know nothing, and there's a ton of paradox. And if I can learn to hold that paradox both through art, which I think is maybe the best way to do it, because there's always room for paradox inside of some kind of artful expression. I don't know anything but art that can like do justice to paradox, really. So like, even like having the wisdom keepers, right? The 64 different stories, they're all completely different, and yet they can all belong inside of one little deck. That's kind of, only art can really do that in some way. So I try to kind of bring the spirit of artfulness into everything that I do, so that there's room for that kind of, that juxtaposition of seeming opposites that actually dance together and create a union that is far greater than our little, logical brains could ever comprehend, but could actually give us some peace in our heart. Mm-hmm. And I think, just when you bring up the wisdom wheel of integrity, I think about, the wheel as the perfect holder of paradox, right? It's sort of, I think in a way it was sort of the culmination of my lifelong journey, and just simplifying it, my attempt to simplify, what are the main seemingly paradoxical, pillars that for me, as like a fine line walker who's constantly shifting my balance, what is that like container that allows for all of those to kind of sing together and work with each other and balance each other out. When I think of the wheel, I mean, of course, we have the wheel within the medicine traditions, indigenous peoples all over the globe. We all, whether it's kind of Buddhist or whether it's Native American, or even whether it's the round table, right? The round table from the Western tradition of equality. And we're all sitting around the table. And so the whole idea of this course is to create a council of wisdom keepers that's unique to each of us, to help us stay in that integrity that I think we all want to be in, if we are to move out into this world that we're living in right now and meet what's happening with the degree of centeredness, and then these qualities, which is loving kindness that's then balanced out with self-respect. Like if you only have loving kindness and you have no self-respect, you end up codependent and not really doing much good. That's a big chunk of my life right there. I'm still working on that particular balance. And I know you know this one personally too. So like, how can we be kind without, without losing our personal boundaries, without having some sense that we are worthy of self-care? I remember once, way back in one of my, spiritual experiments, back in the maybe late 80s, we were doing this money process where everybody was given a certain amount of money, and we'd have to walk around the room, and then the music would stop, and then we'd have to decide how much money to give someone, and they'd decide how much money to give us, and then we'd move on. And the first thing I learned was I immediately gave all my money away.
See, that doesn't surprise me.
Which felt so good in the moment. But then when I get to the next person, I had nothing left to give. And I felt so embarrassed and ashamed. And it was a huge reckoning for me. And so for me, it's so funny, I just remember this story. But anyway, it just reminded me of this self-respect. If we don't have self-respect, if we're not filling our cup, we have no loving kindness left to give, right? So that's obvious. Or if we have self-respect and we're self-righteous, but we're jerks, we can have the best values in the world and really believe in equality and really want to empower people who've been marginalized. But we're not going to necessarily be that effective. And I'm not saying that it is a blanket statement, that there isn't some times where we need to act in ways that are not comfortable. That's a whole other conversation. But I think generally speaking, it's good to have a little loving kindness in one's heart if we're going to be acting in accordance with our principles. So we need to have both of those at play. And then we have the other two. And this one, and it's interesting. I just want to say that for me, loving kindness is very connected to the gene keys, because I feel it's a loving kindness practice towards others, but also towards ourselves and to those parts of us that we tend to cast out, that we reject. It's kindness towards our own shadow. And out of that experience, out of that love, that acceptance, that allowing, that embracing, something beautiful actually emerges. So I feel like Gene Keys are very connected to loving kindness, as well as a lot of my therapeutic background. The self-respect, I feel, has a lot to do with walking a fine line, because there's a lot of exploring about healthy boundaries inside of that work. And what does that mean? And how do we empower the people that we're serving to have self-respect and not to hand over their power to us? So this is like, for me, that feels connected to walking a fine line. Then up here, we've got the courageous self-trust, which has to do with this willingness to break free of our conditioning, to break free of the dogma that we are being bombarded with constantly, which is really pretty much fear-inducing. And when people are afraid, boy, can we be manipulated. And we're learning that now more than ever. It's very difficult for people to be in their integrity when they are bombarded with fear pictures and ridiculed for doing anything that stands outside of the status quo or sort of leaves the conventional reality. So for me, self-trust, courage is very connected to human design, which is all about spirit. It's about like the spiritual practice of decision making, where we're trusting something much deeper than what we've been told and what we're internalizing from the authorities outside, whether they're our parents or whether they're our teachers or the politicians or the pharmaceutical industry or the military industrial complex or whatever we want to say, that we're acting from another place, a deeper place. That sometimes will do one thing and sometimes do something else, and it's not according to any party line. Like anytime I find myself fitting in too much to one particular set of values and structures and actions that have been laid out for me, I start to worry. I'm like, wait, what's happening to my courageous self-trust? And in the Wisdom Wheel of Integrity class, I talk about these asylum officers in the border with Mexico, and the ones that were, I don't know how they did it, but they were able to act differently than what they were being told to do. And what they were being told was actually getting them to do extremely cruel things. Not that they wanted to do it, but they were afraid of losing their jobs, afraid of losing their income, their livelihood. There are a lot of reasons why we're all scared to act in accordance with our deepest sense of conscience. And so human design, courageous self-trust, for me, that's very, very important aspect to integrity. And then what balances that out is what I'm calling reverent surrender, which has to do with this sort of understanding that this mystery is so much bigger than any of us could ever possibly understand. And there is a grand intelligence that's unfolding within and without us, or outside of us. And we need to be humble in relationship to that. And that's maybe where patience comes in. That's where the wisdom keepers come in, where we kind of come to understand that it's not just about courageously imposing our goodwill on the world around us, but also knowing when it's time to have reverence for that for which we have very little control over and may have more complexity, more intelligence, more beauty in it than we can possibly perceive in any given moment. And here for me, this includes nonviolence. In the class, I talk about Gandhi. I talk about non-action, Taoism. That feels extremely important to me too. But none of them on their own allow us to really be in our integrity. We need all of it, and in the heart of it is the imagination, is the creative spirit, is the authentic arising of our unique way of meeting what's happening in the world. Because, not everybody's meant to get out on the streets with a sign, but we need people who do that. And I'm noticing for myself, and this is maybe a good place to sort of come to an end here, is that, I've been really, this is going on for a long time. The world has really been a mess for a really long time. And, sensitives like us, right, our hearts are breaking on a daily basis. And there's also this feeling inside that I've had of like, what can I do about it? What can I do about it? And what would be authentic? What would be like a real, genuine, passionate response coming from the rosiness that I am, as opposed to, you know, these options that are being made available to me that may not be so much of a fit for where I am at this stage of my life and for where my genius shines, or whatever we want to call it, right? And so I feel like, and this reminds me a little bit of that book, I'm trying to remember, was it Elaine Aron that wrote the book about the highly sensitive person? But I remember reading that the highly sensitive people aren't necessarily meant to be the leaders, you know, like the kings and the queens, but they're the advisors to the kings and the queens, right? And I kind of feel like that's more my role. It's like there are going to be a lot of people who are out there on the front lines. I want to be the person supporting them, who has their back and is helping them to stay centered, open-hearted, surrendered, and courageous. That's what I want to do.